The sky over France burned like a forge that morning. Flak blooms opened black and roared against the silver wings of the B-17s. Each burst a jagged question in the cold air. Inside one of those flying fortresses, a 21-year-old tail gunner named Alan Magee checked his guns, strapped his harness, and whispered a prayer he never finished. The mission was briefed as routine. The target, Saint-Nazaire, a spit of harbor and concrete the Germans had turned into a ring of iron. It was the kind of place bomber crews learned to fear the way men learned to fear fire, quickly, and with a memory that never quite healed. Snow rhymed the airfield at Bassingbourn. Engines coughed awake like beasts being coaxed from sleep. The men moved in the half-light, faces drawn. Gloves clutched against a cold that felt bone-deep. Superstition hung in the air. 3 raids in a week was a bad omen. Some crews refused to fly. Others shrugged and climbed aboard. Alan climbed into the narrow tail cone of a B-17 the boys had nicknamed Snap, Crackle, Pop. 10 men climbed into that iron coffin. Pilot Harold Brown, co-pilot Bill Ellen, the bombardier, navigator, waist gunners, ball turret gunner, radio man, flight engineer. Alan was the youngest in the tail, small in the metal room, his world reduced to rivets, cold, and the 2.50 caliber Browning barrels that were his job and his prayer. They took off into a pale winter sky. Formations stretched like a metal web, and the radio squawked with the dry voices of men who had rehearsed fear. As they crossed the channel, a voice crackled. Fighters reported, 11 o'clock high. Black dots on the horizon swelled into Messerschmitts with hot, eager noses. Tracer stitched the sky. Shouts, the thunder of distant explosions, the mechanical scream of engines. War became a cacophony. Flak greeted them like a wall. Black puffs burst into existence above the target, and one of those puffs found Snap. Crackle, pop. A thunderous concussion rode the air. The ship lurched. Hydraulic fluid sprayed. The right wing shuddered. Shards of metal tore through the fuselage. In the tail, a jag hit the skin and sprayed metal and smoke. Alan felt a sting in his arm, metal finding soft meat. Blood smeared the window, air filled with acrid smoke. His oxygen line had been severed. He wrestled the mask back on, but the hiss was thin, the air thinner. The bombardier called target. The pilot, Harold Brown, never lost that tight control in his voice. Calm that had been welded by practice and fear. They were deep in the anvil now. Anti-aircraft batteries every mile, fighters looping like vultures. Another shell detonated under the bomb bay with the sound of a world collapsing. The plane ripped. The midsection was mangled, a jagged wound in aluminum and wire. Instruments winked and died. The radio room was a blackened shell. Men shouted. The intercom spat static and words. Alan's world narrowed to the tail cone. He crawled back, bracing against bulkheads, boots slipping on oil and metal. The fuselage creaked like an old ship in a storm. Then, with a violence that hollowed every bone, the bomb bay, shaken by something inside it or underneath, gave up. A violent shearing ripped across the belly. A rushing sound, an emptiness, filled his ears. Metal tore, and where there had been continuity there was now an opening to the sky. He felt the plane come apart like a house collapsing. Ahead of him, the fuselage snapped. A piece no larger than the length of a man, shuddered and separated. It was the forward fuselage that went first, then the tail section sheared loose. For a fraction of a second, everything was a tableau. Fire, men, instruments, spinning sky. The tail, where Alan crouched, pitched and swung like a lifeboat cast from a sinking liner. There was no time to think. Training is a set of motions learned in safer rooms. In the tail, with the world unglued, training was a litany of reflex. Alan grabbed at braces, at screws, at anything to hold the gun mount. He felt a massive jolt, felt his boots lift from the floor. The tail separated with a sound like a thunderclap swallowed by the rush of wind. Suddenly, the only thing between him and oblivion was a narrow cone of aluminum, the tail's skin and frame, screaming downward into a sky that seemed to lengthen forever. He recognized, with the cold clarity of a man watching his life in a single breath, that there was no parachute. The ship had lost its canopy of human hope somewhere in the tear. The rest of the plane, those who had been in the forward fuselage, were gone or gone into other fragments. He could not tell through the smoke. All he knew was the tail and the world rushing past it, and the fact that the air had become a river and he was a stone. Falling at terminal velocity is not like Hollywood. The wind is not merely noise. It is a living thing that demands respect. It threw his body, smaller than the machine that had held him, into a spinning descent. The tail, sparse and open to the elements, rotated in a grotesque ballet. Tools, fragments of instruments, and personal items popped away, twirling into the void. Alan tasted blood and metal. The radio had been ripped from its moorings. The intercom was a dead throat. His world had narrowed to the metal skin beneath his palms, to the sight of the earth slowly aligning, and to a horror that had no name. As he fell, his training offered him nothing. Yet instincts, a mixture of fear and the body's refusal to surrender, made him act. He twisted, pivoted, tried to climb into the small alcove where the twin .50s were mounted, and for a ridiculous, holy moment, he was strapped in, his harness digging into his shoulders, his palms on the cold barrels. The tail section keened, wings of metal slicing the sky, and then, at a speed that translated seconds into ages, realization came back. Without the parachute, the harness was a noose. The metal shell around him was not a refuge but a coffin. It is hard to describe the perception of time in a fall like that. Moments stretch into rooms. The small things bloom into meaning. He saw a church steeple, then a river, then the silver thread of a road. He saw, impossibly, the faces of friends, fellow gunners, the pilot with his jaw clenched, his mother's hands knitting in memory of a moment yet to be written. He heard a laugh, maybe his own, maybe someone else's from a time before. He thought of music, of some illicit song shared in a barracks. He thought of the desert sky of New Mexico where he had once lay on his back and watched stars and felt safe. At around 7,000 feet, something happened that would later be retold as miracle and luck in equal measure. The tail struck, first gentle, then with a violence. It hit the roof of a large, glass-covered train station, and the sound of shattering glass was like an explosion that compressed the world. The tail section slammed through panes, tore into girders, and in those last heartbeats the physics of the fall conspired with something else. A tree, a ledge, a piece of metal, that arrested motion just enough to change death into an improbability. Alan was thrown forward, then back, then forward again. He was stunned into a clarity that was pain wrapped in disbelief. When he came to, the tail section was a mangled cradle lodged in the station's glass and steel. Sunlight, or what remained of it, filtered through broken panes, casting a web of light over metal and broken bodies. He crawled out, blood cold on his hands, the world tilting and smelling of dust and smoke and the iron tang of fear. People ran. Not just soldiers, civilians, eyes wide, mouths open. He remembered being grabbed by hands that were small and huge at once. Someone screamed in a language he did not know. Men in uniforms, a mixture of military and plain clothes, rushed, and for a moment, amidst the chaos, a human face bent close and asked, "Vous allez bien? You are alive?" Alan tried to answer. His mouth tasted of blood. His arm was a strip of pain and red. He could not feel below his knees. He could feel nothing. Yet breath rose and fell. His chest expanded in labor. The train station was a cathedral of broken glass. It became, for a few stunned minutes, a place where time and jungle and combat treaties made no sense. Word broke from mouth to mouth. An American airman, alive in the ruins. Someone started to cry. Someone else offered a scarf. A woman, young, with a face the color of clay and eyes like the station's broken panes, put her hands to his forehead and murmured prayers in a voice both thin and fierce. But in those first raw minutes, in the light of the shattered station, Alan Magee stared at the sky he had fallen through and understood something private and large. The world is less certain than we think. Steel can break in ways that let life out. The same heavens that rain death sometimes deliver impossible returns. He was alive, and that fact would, in the long arc of time, write a strange little chapter into the ledger of the war. A chapter that men would tell around fires, in mess halls, in quiet rooms where survivors kept their mouths shut out of superstition or reverence. As the sirens began to swell and uniforms moved like a tide toward order, Alan closed his eyes for a heartbeat and felt, in that breath, both sorrow for the men he had left behind and a fierce, awkward gratitude for a second life he had not planned to live. The cell was small, the walls sweating cold stone. A single cot, a tin cup, and the smell of disinfectant mixed with damp straw. When Alan Magee woke, it was to pain, a deep, bone-heavy ache that made breathing feel like work. The world swam in a fog of morphine and fever. He didn't know if he was alive or somewhere between. Outside the barred window, boots echoed against cobblestones, and somewhere, a door clanged shut with the sound of finality. For 2 days he drifted in and out. Sometimes he heard German voices, low, clipped, efficient. Sometimes the murmur of a woman, her accent soft and strange, placing a damp cloth on his forehead. Once, through the haze, he saw a doctor in a Wehrmacht coat bending over him, shaking his head and muttering, "Unglaublich, sollt tot sein." Incredible, he should be dead. Later, when the army would write reports and men would be debriefed and historians would debate the exact sequence of physics that allowed a man to survive a fall from 24,000 feet, the facts would be measured and halved and multiplied. But in that unreal hour, the simple facts were utter and elemental. A B-17 had been shot to pieces over enemy territory. A tail gunner had fallen. He had struck a train station and lived. He would be taken into custody, questioned, examined. He would tell the story in halting words because many things were missing: words for the way the sky felt, words for the sound of parts tearing apart, words for the way a station looked from the inside out when you had just been a visitor from the heavens. Word of his survival spread fast. The crew that had not survived were counted and mourned. The names would be read at chapels, carved in ledgers, whispered into the cold air of barracks far from the glass and stone of that station. Alan would later be photographed. Faces solemn, uniforms awkward, and people would call him a miracle, a lucky man, a ghost come down from the clouds. He would carry scars, not all of them visible. He would carry memory like a heavy coat. In the days that followed, while the war rumbled on and the maps of Europe changed with the slow certainty of tides, army doctors would measure his broken body. Medics would marvel at the fact that a fall from such a height had not crushed his chest, that his internal organs had stayed, by some grace, whole enough to let him live. Questions would ride every report. Was it the tail section that slowed him? Did he hit something else first? Was it pure luck, physics, providence? Experts argued. Priests prayed. Men in gray suits nodded, made notes, and sent him on to places where men like him were studied, catalogued, made into data points for a mechanized war. When the fog began to lift, so did the weight of disbelief. They told him, slowly through an interpreter, that he had fallen over 20,000 feet. The tail section of his B-17 had smashed through the glass roof of the Saint-Nazaire train station, and by a combination of torn metal, splintered beams, and sheer miracle, his fall had been broken just enough to let him live. He had fractured his ribs, broken his right arm, and torn open his leg. But he was alive. Alive in enemy hands. On the third day, 2 Luftwaffe officers entered the infirmary. One carried a clipboard, the other a pistol at his side. Their boots stopped at the foot of his bed. "Name," the officer demanded. "Staff Sergeant Alan Magee," he managed through cracked lips. "Squadron, 360th Bomb Group, 8th Air Force." The officer's pen scratched paper. "Target." Magee looked him in the eye. "I was unconscious before the drop," he said. "Didn't see. It was the oldest trick in the book. Say little, stay alive." The officer's gaze lingered, hard and skeptical. But there was something else there too. Curiosity. The Germans had seen men die 1,000 ways. But this one they couldn't quite understand. A man who fell from 6 miles above the earth and lived? It was, even for them, a story worth keeping. They transferred him to Stalag Luft 3, a camp reserved for Allied airmen. It was winter when he arrived, gray, bitter, endless. The barracks were long wooden huts, each filled with bunks stacked 3 high. The air smelled of wood smoke and despair. The men there had hollow faces but sharp eyes. They were survivors of other skies, men who had seen their machines burn and somehow lived to tell it. When Magee limped through the gate, wrapped in a tattered coat, someone shouted, "New fish!" Another yank. "Where'd they get you?" another called. "Saint-Nazaire," he replied. "Bad place," someone muttered. Magee nodded. "You've no idea." They gathered around him that night in the dim light of a single bulb. He told the story as best he could. The flak, the explosion, the fall, the glass roof, the shock of waking up in German hands. For a long time, no one spoke. Then one of the older men, an RAF navigator with hollow cheeks, let out a low whistle. 20,000 feet, he said. "And you lived." Magee nodded slowly. The RAF man grinned. "Well, lads, looks like God's got a sense of humor." In the months that followed, life in Stalag Luft 3 became a rhythm. Roll call, rations, cold nights, and the endless hum of rumors. Escape tunnels were dug and discovered. Letters from home arrived in batches, sometimes months late. Magee spent his days repairing uniforms, sketching, and staring out through the barbed wire at skies he could no longer touch. But he couldn't stop thinking about the fall. He replayed it in his mind again and again, the way the air felt, the way silence had weight. He began to dream of it, falling, spinning, waiting for the impact that never came. Some nights he woke gasping, heart hammering against the thin walls of his chest. Others found him sitting outside, watching the moon through the wire, whispering, "Why me?" It wasn't guilt so much as wonder. Men better than him had died for less. He was just a tail gunner, one of thousands. Yet somehow he'd been pulled back from death like a coin fished out of the ocean. Then came word, quiet, coded, but real, that the war was shifting. The Russians were advancing from the east. The Americans and British had landed in Normandy. Liberation was no longer a dream whispered in dark corners. It was a rumor that smelled like hope. By January 1945, the guards began to change. Faces hardened. Orders grew desperate. The prisoners knew something was coming, but not what. One bitter night, they were ordered to march hundreds of men, sick, wounded, half-starved, out into the snow. The Germans were retreating, dragging their captives with them, westward into the cold. Magee walked until his legs went numb. Men collapsed in the snow, and the guards left them there. He thought of his fall, how the air had swallowed him, and realized this march was no different. Another descent, another test of how much the human spirit could take before it broke. When liberation finally came, it was like waking from a nightmare that had lasted years. American troops rolled into the shattered remains of the camp. Prisoners wept openly. Men who hadn't spoken in months embraced each other like brothers. Magee stood still, staring at the flag snapping in the spring wind, and for the first time since that terrible day over France, he let himself cry. Years later, when he returned home, people would ask him about the fall. "How did you survive?" they'd say. He'd smile softly, almost shyly, and answer, "Maybe I didn't fall. Maybe I was just carried." Alan Magee lived until 2003. He was 84 years old. In that long span of borrowed time, he never called himself lucky. He said he'd simply been given one more mission, to remember those who never came home. And in the quiet moments, when he looked at the sky, he sometimes whispered the same words he had before that fateful flight. "Here's to the ones still up there." When Alan Magee stepped back onto American soil, the air itself felt different, soft, forgiving, and full of sound. It was spring, 1945. Flags hung from every window. Bands played on every corner. But inside him, something was still falling. The train ride home was a blur of faces. Soldiers laughing, crying, staring out the window like they were afraid to blink and wake up back in the war. Magee sat quietly by the glass, his right arm still stiff, his ribs aching with each breath. He watched the landscape roll by, green fields, white fences, the kind of peace that felt almost unreal after years of thunder and flame. When he stepped onto the platform at Plainfield, New Jersey, his mother was there. She was smaller than he remembered, older too, but when she saw him, She dropped her purse and ran. For a moment, time itself broke. He held her and smelled home, the faint scent of lilacs and laundry soap, and realized he had made it back to a world that had stopped waiting for most men like him. In the months that followed, reporters came. First a local paper, then Life magazine. They wanted the miracle story, the tail gunner who fell from the sky and lived. Cameras flashed. Questions flew like bullets. How high did you fall? What went through your mind? Do you believe it was divine intervention? Magee gave the same quiet answers. 22,000 feet. I don't remember much after the explosion. Maybe it was luck. Maybe it was something else. He never called himself a hero. In every interview he mentioned the others, the crew of Snap, Crackle, Pop, who didn't make it home. They were the heroes, he'd say. I just happened to land in the right place. But the story wouldn't fade. Newspapers dubbed him the man who fell from heaven. Pilots pinned his photo in their ready rooms. Teachers told his story to children as proof that courage and fate could meet halfway. Still, for Magee, the hardest part wasn't surviving the fall. It was learning how to live again. He tried working in a factory, but the noise of the machines made him flinch. He tried sleeping, but the dreams came, always the same. Falling, spinning, the roar of the wind. Sometimes he woke shouting, gripping the sheets as though they were parachute cords that wouldn't open. Then one evening, he found himself walking near an airfield. The sound of a propeller drifted through the air, soft, rhythmic, almost soothing. He stood there a long time, watching a trainer plane rise into the golden sky. It didn't scare him, steadied him. The next day, he walked into the hangar and asked for a job. They gave him one. He worked as a mechanic, then as a technician, and eventually as a small plane pilot. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man who had fallen from the sky now making his living inside it again. But he said it helped him breathe. Years passed. The war faded into memory, but his story refused to die. In 1993, 50 years after the fall, France invited him back. The Saint-Nazaire train station had long been rebuilt, but the spot where his tail section had struck was marked with a small plaque. It read, "To Staff Sergeant Alan Magee, who fell from the sky and lived," a symbol of courage, survival, and the strange mercy of fate. When he arrived, the town gathered to greet him. Old men who had been boys during the war shook his hand. Children handed him flowers. Someone handed him a piece of the old roof glass, green, cracked, polished by time. Standing there, beneath the rebuilt station, Magee looked up at the steel beams above and smiled. "Looks higher from down here," he said softly. Reporters waited for him to speak more, but he didn't. He just stared at the sky, eyes wet, as if he were seeing his own ghost still falling through the clouds. That evening, a local veteran approached him and asked, "Do you ever think about why you survived when others didn't?" Magee paused for a long time. Then he said, "Every day. But maybe it wasn't about why. Maybe it was about what for. He lived quietly after that. Married, raised a family, told his grandchildren bedtime stories that began with, 'Once, I fell out of a plane,' and ended with laughter instead of fear. When Alan Magee passed away in 2003, his obituary was short, humble, just like him. But the final line read, "He once fell from 22,000 feet without a parachute and lived to tell about it." Today, pilots still tell his story, not as a miracle but as a lesson. That sometimes, survival isn't about strength or luck. It's about refusing to stop fighting, even when the sky itself seems determined to end you. Because in that frozen air over France, in the roar of flak and fire, Alan Magee didn't just fall. He defied gravity, fate, and death itself, and lived to remind the world what hope looks like when it refuses to die. The years after the war faded softly, like the last echoes of a distant engine. Alan Magee had learned to live with silence, but not without memory. Each scar on his body had a voice, and sometimes, on quiet mornings, he swore he could still hear the sound of wind rushing past his ears. The same wind that once carried him from the heavens to the earth. He never spoke much about what the fall felt like. People wanted numbers, altitude, speed, impact force, but they never asked about the silence between those seconds, the weightless calm when a man knows he's already left the world behind. Magee said that was the part that never left him. It's strange, he once told a friend. The sky gives, and the sky takes, but sometimes it gives you back. In the 1980s, Alan began writing letters to other airmen, men who'd flown in B-17s, who'd lost crews, who carried the same invisible burdens. They called themselves the Last Crew, a brotherhood of survivors who met once a year to tell their stories before time could steal their voices. They'd gather in hotel halls, wearing faded uniforms and medals that had long lost their shine. Coffee cups in hand, they'd laugh, curse, cry, and remember. And when the night got quiet, someone would always ask Magee to tell his story again. He never glorified it, never made it sound like destiny. He'd start with a small smile and say, "Well, fellas, I just ran out of airplane." The room would fill with laughter, but behind that humor was a truth every man there understood. That survival was never just luck. It was the stubborn refusal to let go, even when gravity tried to pull you into oblivion. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of VE Day, the Air Force invited Alan to speak. He stood before a crowd of young cadets, clean-shaven, full of promise, faces untouched by the kind of fear he'd known. Behind him hung a restored B-17, polished and perfect, a ghost made new. He took a deep breath, looked at the massive plane, and began. "I was a tail gunner, just one of 10 men inside a machine built to fall apart. We flew because someone had to. We fought because someone had to. And we fell because that was part of the deal." He paused, the room silent. "I used to ask myself why I lived. But the older I got, the clearer it became. Maybe the fall wasn't meant to kill me. Maybe it was meant to wake me up, to remind me what life really costs, and what it means to keep living when others couldn't." When he finished, the cadets stood and applauded. But Magee just smiled, his hands trembling slightly on the podium. "Don't clap for me," he said softly. "Clap for the ones who never got the chance to land." In his final years, Alan moved to a small town in New Mexico, a place where the skies were wide and the air tasted like freedom. Every morning, he'd sit on his porch with a cup of coffee, looking at the horizon. Sometimes a plane would pass overhead, and he'd tip his cap. One afternoon, a neighbor's boy, barely 10 years old, rode up on his bike and asked, "Mr. Magee, is it true you fell from the sky?" Magee chuckled. "That's what they tell me." "Weren't you scared?" the boy asked. He looked at the boy for a long moment, then said, "Everyone's scared when they fall. The trick is, don't stop looking up, even on the way down." The boy didn't quite understand, but years later he would. When Alan Magee passed away in 2003, the Air Force sent a letter of honor. His ashes were scattered from a small plane over the ocean, the same kind of sky he once fell through. And those who watched that day swore the clouds opened just a little, as if the heavens themselves remembered the man who refused to die. Because some stories don't end when the heart stops beating. Some stories keep flying. And if you ever find yourself standing under a quiet sky, you might just hear it. The whisper of wind through broken glass, the echo of courage that fell, shattered, and still survived. Alan Magee, the man who fell 22,000 feet, and taught the world what it means to rise again.